Welcome to the 28 Storms Tropical Weather Update for Friday, July 1st. We are all clear in the tropics on this 4th of July weekend. There is nothing of any significance that could possibly form into anything noteworthy within the next few days. There is a very weak wave that's really not even showing up on satellite imagery. It's over on the western half of Cuba that extends down toward Honduras, and it is flaring up some very weak convection as it heads off into Central America. The only other significant or halfway noteworthy wave that's currently on the maps today is this tropical wave now interacting with an upper level low between Puerto Rico and Hispaniola. You can see that convection has been on the increase due to the upper level divergence aloft, which is very beneficial for convective development, but not so much for actual tropical cyclogenesis. And you can see this even better on the water vapor image. That upper level low is really carved out across much of eastern Cuba, Jamaica, and Haiti, and out ahead and just to the east of that upper level low is very strong vertical wind shear aloft. Now, some of the models are actually lessening the wind shear and developing an upper level ridge more to the southeast of this upper level low as the upper level low itself begins to move more off toward the west. That would set up a more favorable pattern across much of the central Caribbean toward the early and middle half of next week. But several of the models are shearing off this tropical wave well into the western Atlantic before ever becoming an organized tropical disturbance. This is 40 to 50 knots of extreme southwest wind shear, so certainly this is not a favorable environment ahead of this upper level low that you see right here and all the aforementioned southwest wind shear. We can see the evolution of this tropical wave as it moves more toward the west on the precipitable water analysis. As you can see, the tropical wave is very broad in nature. There's no sign of any significant rotation embedded within it, and it's just moving westward without doing much of anything. We are now looking at today's low-level steering. We still have the dominant subtropical Atlantic ridge centered over the central Atlantic. There's a very small weakness over much of the eastern seaboard of the United States, and then there's a second area of ridging dominating much of the southeast United States in Tennessee and Ohio valleys. Now, what's expected to happen is this pattern will remain in place for the next 3 to 5 days, and our tropical wave currently located right here is expected to continue moving off toward the west-northwest towards Hispaniola, Jamaica, and Cuba, and the European and GFS members have much of the energy being sheared off and being taken up into this weakness over the western Atlantic and then steadily moving out to sea. The only somewhat interesting model solution is the Canadian CMC, which keeps the system more toward the southern half of the possible track and into much of the central and western Caribbean, and by the time it begins to move north into the weakness, it does so more over the southeast Gulf of Mexico while attempting to develop into a tropical depression or tropical storm. Here's the CMC model that I alluded to, and it begins to develop a weak area of low pressure and quickly develops it into a tropical storm as it parallels the western half of the Florida Peninsula into the Big Bend of Florida by day 6. We can see that the tropical wave over the southeast Caribbean is the culprit if we track the 850 millibar vorticity max, and there it goes marching across the Caribbean. It ends up near Jamaica, and then it splits off a second piece of energy as soon as it hits Jamaica, and then it begins to move up the Florida Peninsula. This is the CMC shear forecast, and this is a very familiar look because this is the current shear pattern. We saw on the SIMS shear analysis that the upper level low was located between the Bahamas, eastern Cuba, and Hispaniola, and right out ahead of it we saw very strong wind shear, and look at what the Canadian decides to do. It pulls the upper level low more toward the north, and then a second one develops off toward the Yucatan Peninsula. And I'll stop this next time it loops, and we see this is now by 96 hours we have favorable upper level ridging near Cuba and the Florida Keys, which is exactly where the low pressure area tries to form on the model, and that favorable upper level ridge follows it up the Florida Peninsula through the period. Now, before anyone in Florida begins to freak out, that is the only model that shows anything remotely like this at this time, and the Canadian model is typically not as good as our more reliable GFS and ECMWF models. This is the latest sea level pressure forecast from the GFS, and you can see that the model keeps things in the tropics fairly tranquil throughout the next 6 to 7 days. We do see a lowering of surface pressures across much of the Caribbean, southeast Gulf of Mexico, and southwest Atlantic, but nothing stands out like a tropical cyclone would. We can also see that the GFS simply is not as aggressive with this particular tropical wave. You can see the evolution of it, and then the difference between the Canadian is that it takes more of the energy into the Bahamas as that upper level low to the west begins to shear it more toward the north. And then by day 7, if I stop that at day 7, we see that this is where the main area of low pressure is, just to the southwest of the Bahamas. And as of right now, the GFS is really not even that interested in developing this out across the western Atlantic. One thing the GFS does agree with the CMC on is that if the system, or any system for that matter, were to be located in the central to western Caribbean near day 4, we would be looking at a much more favorable pattern down here as the main upper level trough lifts more toward the north and we're left with very little shear. Areas of blue are less than 5 to 10 knots, so that's a very favorable upper level ridge. It's just that the model takes the system more into the unfavorable westerlies of the Bahamas and southwest Atlantic instead. The latest European run is somewhat of a blend between the CMC and GFS, but it still doesn't show any tropical development. We can see a very weak signal of our tropical wave at the current time. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3, Day 4. Still not much sign of our tropical wave as it keeps it very weak, but we do see a slight increase in low-level energy that is elongated and very disorganized from the southeast Gulf of Mexico extending eastward all the way through the Bahamas and into the western Atlantic. And by day 5, we don't really see any organized feature whatsoever. But if anything, some of this energy is trying to be entrained into a boundary stretched across the eastern seaboard. And by day 6, yeah, we do see a little bit more energy to the east of Florida as it begins to lift north into that non-tropical trough that is situated over the mid-Atlantic and northeast states. We are not overly enthused about that tropical wave, but that would be the main player if anything were to try to form over the next week. And in the meantime, we're still looking at the Madden-Julian oscillation forecasts, and the GFS ensemble members are continuing to be bullish on the idea of the MJO moving deeper into octants 1 and 2, as we can see on this chart. And typically this does raise the odds of tropical development in the Atlantic Basin, and especially the western half of the basin. So we will continue to keep a close watch on the tropics, as things are looking a bit more favorable than normal. If you recall, yesterday we included not only a daily video update, but we also added a discussion to the potential for early season Cape Verde development, of course between the Lesser Antilles and coast of Africa, by the middle part of July, which is a bit sooner than we would expect climatologically. And we still think that is a very distinct possibility, but we will be watching not only the deep tropical Atlantic, but also the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico along with the western Atlantic, as I alluded to. Not just for the tropical disturbance or tropical wave that we're currently keeping an eye on with the charts, but also there are some more model hints and climatological hints that we're in for an above average July throughout much of the entire basin. And we have a new link on the top of the website today. Just go to 28storms.com. You can go to it either by clicking on the long range page, because that is where it's located, or the much larger link in orange right here. So go ahead and take a look at that if you're interested. We're also looking pretty good out here in the eastern Pacific. There is really nothing imminent. This is only one highlighted area from the National Hurricane Center in their latest outlook. And what's occurring is the remnants of Arlene's mid-level circulation is still moving west over much of mainland Mexico. And by the time it gets into the eastern Pacific, there won't be much of anything left of it. And not only that, but it will be entering the Pacific in a region where sea surface temperatures are fairly cool. This is the same general area where Hurricane Beatrice quickly dissipated within about a 12 to 24 hour span. So we're not expecting anything from Arlene in the future. The favorable upper level ridge that strengthened Arlene over the Gulf of Mexico also pushed westward into mainland Mexico, as denoted here by these darker blue colors of areas with no wind shear. But look at what's going on around it. Nothing but really strong winds aloft and a lot of unfavorable conditions. You can see it even better on this map. The upper level ridging is across much of Mexico and the far northeast Pacific, where sea surface temperatures are too cool, and that's causing a lot of wind shear over our tropical formation zone more toward the south. You can also see this on satellite imagery. We're now looking to the south of Mexico. Here's the Gulf of Tehuantepec, just for a frame of reference. And there's really nothing organized out here at the moment. There's a lot of wind shear. However, there is a lot of disorganized convection. And a couple of the models are trying to key on this very weak convective blob out here to the south of Guatemala, and El Salvador. And if we take just a very quick look at the GFS, you'll notice that down here, where that blob is located, the model does initialize a very weak 1008 millibar broad area of low pressure. And over time, it really doesn't want to do much until we get into about the 2 to 3 day time frame, where it potentially tries to organize into something a little bit more significant, but the model really is not latching on to any development at this time. If anything, it wants to develop this as it moves more out into the open waters of the eastern Pacific away from Mexico, so that is a possibility. But either way, we'll just keep an eye on it here for you at 28storms.com. So that's your update today. Check back for more updates throughout this 4th of July weekend as we will continue to update the website. And go ahead and have a good one.